and you can put it just about in any corridor, any room that you want. Just all of a sudden, here it comes around the corner and engulfs the players or whatever else. It's just doing its job. It's the janitor of the dungeon. It's sweeping the floors, cleaning the ceiling, things like that. And all of a sudden, the players just wrong place, wrong time.
Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, but I'm not going to do that alone. I have Wally DM with me, and we're going to talk about wandering monsters in Dungeons and Dragons. And I specifically want to talk about wandering monsters in Dungeons and Dragons 5e. Hi, Wally, how's it going?
Good, Fred. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited about this topic.
Now, both of us have had probably plenty of experience with wandering monsters, and I thought it would be nice to cover some of the basic questions around wandering monsters because I think people get very confused about what their purpose is and how important they are. And I guess the first question would be, what are wandering monsters, Wally?
Well, wandering monsters are usually found on tables, and that it's a tool that the DM can use to not really surprise your players, but if they're being not as careful or they are wandering about, there's always a chance that some creature is out there that might be hungry, that might be curious, and they are going to encounter the party. So a DM can roll a die, and depending on that die roll, it will determine if there is a chance for an encounter. And if there is, then the DM can refer to a table or a chart and see what type of an encounter that is.
I guess my first question would be because, I think a lot of people associate the wandering monster as just a random combat encounter, right? Where you roll on a
Mm-hmm.
chart. But if you look at some of the older modules that were put out, there was a random combat encounter or random monster encounter chart or table.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another monster that was considered the wandering monster. And that wandering monster was usually the common population in that location. So there was usually only a couple of them. So if you did have a chart, it was very small. It wasn't like a roll of D20. You might
Mm-hmm.
be rolling a D6 to determine what you find. And the types of monsters or creatures that would be roaming around, because that's what a wandering monster is, they roam around. They could be a patrolling monster in that location to keep it safe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was basically usually a very select number of creatures, right? Where you didn't
Yes.
have this huge variation. Then you had what was called a random table, where you could, which is much larger,
Mm-hmm.
and the variation and difficulty went from extremely easy creatures and monsters to extremely deadly, dangerous monsters. Wandering monsters usually didn't fall into the realm of being incredibly deadly. They were just usually the population of that area. Does that
Right.
seem about right to you?
It sounds about right. In fact, I've got my old Beck Me Red Book series here, and I do have a Wandering Monster table. And I took a quick look at it, and like if I were to take a goblin, for instance, and it says number appearing 1 through 6, but if I were to actually look up the goblin in my old monster manual for this series, it would actually number appearing would be much larger. So on the table there, there's a smaller number, and you're exactly right. It was just to say that there's creatures out, perhaps maybe coming back from a hunt. Perhaps they were in a small battle. They're coming back. They're wounded. Maybe even trying to skirt around the party, and unfortunately they got noticed, and things like that.
Yeah, because the idea behind the wandering monster was really to sort of put across that the environment or the dungeon or location was a living place, that it
Mm-hmm.
didn't just have a set room or location and everything stayed where it was. Things did move around. But the wandering monster itself wasn't necessarily a monster that moved from a location, it was constantly on the move.
Mm.
And I think that's the difference between a random encounter and a random encounter table, is that these usually were monsters or creatures that were constantly on the move in that particular location. So, why would we use wandering monsters in our games, Wally? I know I have a whole bunch of ideas and reasons why you would use them, and there's a bunch of stuff on the internet
Mm-hmm.
about why you should use them, and also a bunch of ideas around why you shouldn't use wandering monsters, and that Essentially everything in the game should have a story purpose, and you need to cut the fat, and anything that doesn't have a story purpose should be eliminated. What do you think in terms of that?
As far as cutting the fat, I agree to a certain extent. I mean, I do like to have a little bit of purpose for my monsters, and honestly, that could just be, as I previously stated, they're hungry, they're out scouting. Perhaps they see an adventuring party. It's at night. They see a campfire. They, they get a little bit curious, so they get a little bit closer. Things of that natures. But I like the wandering monsters. I like to put them in my game. Number one, if the characters don't set up a proper guard, if they're noisy, things like that, then I'd like to maybe increase the chances that a wandering monster is going to come around, just to kind of say, hey, you're being a little bit careless. The things out here are going to eat you alive if you're not careful with how you're traveling and things like that. Now, a lot of DMs could also throw in like wandering monsters just to drain a party's resources. Perhaps they're at full health and they're coming up to like the end boss, and they want to see if a wandering monster comes about, and they could just actually just throw one in there. So it's not so random there. It's just all of a sudden, this monster comes out because the DM wants to drain the party's resources a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think in terms of wandering monsters as having so many different purposes that you can often view a wandering monster like a random encounter, which has essentially you would view it as having no real purpose, but there is a good purpose for them. How many times have we both had to contend with a dungeon master who says, my players keep resting. They keep taking short rest or long rests. What do I
Ex-
do? Because after they've had every single battle, they want to take a short rest or a long rest and get all their resources back. And so
mm-hmm.
essentially, the wandering monster had to deal with the same problem in earlier versions of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And we really need to use them again in the newest version of Dungeons and Dragons 5e, because it stops players taking a rest every single time they want to take a rest. It stops them from resting in dangerous locations and dungeons when they should have gone somewhere else rather than hanging out in the most dangerous location, which for me as a dungeon master, I would certainly consider that prime time to drop something on them. And then you think about all those encounters that you've built trying to test their metal, and they go supernova. So it's essentially the wandering monster stops players and using the entire party resources, going supernova, blowing all of their resources in one battle, and then they've got nothing left because, well, actually, now we can't do that. There may be something else that wanders across our path,
Mm-hmm.
tries to eat us or wants to attack us or capture us. So yeah, I feel like it is trying to make the environment feel a bit more real too. It
Mm-hmm.
allows player characters to actually capture monsters and interrogate them and
Mm-hmm.
collect information. And it allows, particularly if they haven't done a very good job, as you said, right, of being stealthy and keeping their presence unknown, of whoever's running this location, this dungeon or area,
Mm-hmm.
they can actively search for intruders who are trying to infiltrate, and probably would be assuming that somebody will at some point try to do that. So it's always going on.
Exactly. Yeah, and back to the dungeon point. I mean, I've played games before where we've had like one big battle. And they're like, "Well, we're going to take a long rest." And it's like, "You've only been adventuring for half an hour. That's okay. We're going to camp out here. We're going to have a long rest." And they do that over and over and over, and just totally abuse the system. So wandering monsters are definitely great for that. And another thing I'd like to add too, if you don't mind, is it doesn't always have to be monsters. Sometimes it can be NPCs. You could stumble across other adventures and possibly even create rivals out of this. Perhaps someone else is on the way and they have the same goal, and they could maybe set like a trap to try to slow your party down or something like that, try to take advantage of them. And you can have a role playing scenario with wandering monsters that are actually just adventurers or NPCs.
And I think we kind of covered the next question, which is what is the difference between random encounters and wandering monsters? I think you highlighted it, and I've highlighted it. That
Yeah.
really wandering monsters aren't random. If anything, a wandering monster is usually set up on a time frame,
Mm-hmm.
so they're moving through that space at a certain time, whether that be every half hour, every hour, or maybe they only move through that area once a day, or there's a trigger, something that the
Hmm.
players' characters have to do that triggers that wandering monster to go and start moving around the location. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is like watching zombie movies or like The Walking Dead. I mean, they're just like walking around, but if characters enter like this building or something, all of a sudden making noise, and then all of a sudden they get the creature's attention and they just kind of divert and start walking around. It also adds to it too that not everything does have a purpose. Sometimes things are just by chance. This monster's walking this way, you're walking this way. The two of you meet up, you interact, and then things go on from there. So um, that way, it kind of keeps the players from expecting, okay, well, this has got to have a purpose. Sometimes an empty room is an empty room, and sometimes a wandering monster is just a wandering monster.
wandering monsters don't necessarily have no value in my game, and that my players view them very differently to what I, as a dungeon master, view them as, because they
Mm-hmm.
see them as one, an opportunity to gain more experience and level their character up fast if they're using XP.
Mm-hmm.
They consider it an opportunity to loot the body and get more treasure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they also view it as an opportunity, certainly, to interact with those, because they don't necessarily attack. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Wandering monsters can be bargained with,
Mm-hmm.
though there's not necessarily going to be an definite combat or battle that takes place, right?
Absolutely. And that again takes me back to my Redbox day. I love the old Redbox Back Me series. They had a chart in there. It was a 2d6 chart, if I'm not mistaken, that you could use with your wandering monsters, and you rolled on it, and it could go from either they were friendly, which was like the lower roll, they could be indifferent, or they could be hostile. So if you, as a DM, if you just wanted to randomly determine, the party comes across these four orcs, maybe they're friendly, maybe these are just, they're just trying to get from one place to the other, and depending on who gains surprise or initiative is going to figure out what the outcome is. But just because, like you said, just because there's a monster out there doesn't mean you have to have combat. Some of the monsters are just trying to get through and continue on with their life.
So I thought it would be really interesting and useful for people to have an idea of some of the common or generic wandering monsters based on the different locations.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe that the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide has sort of like some charts that give you a breakdown of different areas and the
They do.
sorts of creatures and the CR rating.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily that CR rating or challenge rating is useful completely. There's a point where it's useful and a point where it isn't, but breaking it down in terms of that location and what you could expect to find. And I thought maybe you could share some of the sort of common monsters that you would utilize
Mm-hmm.
in your own game as a wandering creature, say something like the Underdark or a dungeon. What would you might find?
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to this part. This is fun. So for dungeons, I broke it down. I've got two entries for each one. You asked for one, but I'm always going to bring two, and that's because I want one to be more of a combat one, and one to be more of how could I include a non-combat or a role-playing opportunity. So for the combat part, for being in a dungeon, is the gelatinous cube. It's part of the ecosystem of the dungeon, and you can put it just about in any corridor, any room that you want. Just all of a sudden, here it comes around the corner and engulfs the players or whatever else. It's just doing its job. It's the janitor of the dungeon. It's sweeping the floors, cleaning the ceiling, things like that. And all of a sudden, the players just wrong place, wrong time. The second one would be more my non-combat. So if I wanted to include a little bit of role playing, and I'll include like spirits or ghosts, and of course I'll make them different than what's in the monster manual. But if I want to either give some information, maybe give a warning or a false warning or things of that nature, then I'll include a spirit of someone, maybe a former adventurer who had died in the dungeon.
I really like that. That's really creative, far more creative than what I've come up with.
I'm sure it's not. What you got there, Fred?
Either it can be a battle or can be a conversation, and who would probably be underlings to whoever the villain is in that location. So I picked the Drow
Mm-hmm.
and troglodytes for sort of underground areas, and also goblins, orcs, and ogres, which are pretty
Absolutely.
common in pretty much
Mm-hmm.
any environment, really. I mean, you can have goblins, orcs, and ogres in just about every single location you can think of.
Absolutely. And I really like that you use troglodytes. Those are like one of my favorite monsters. You don't see them as much anymore, but definitely a classic right there.
So, what about forests in terms of some wandering monsters that you could incorporate in a forest area?
Two things on the forest, and again, I'm going combat and a role playing. I'm picking two different monsters. First, I'll start off with my role playing one, and that's the Dryad. I think having a adventuring party, maybe encountering two or three different dryads. One of them gets charmed into wanting to stay with the dryad. I think fey creatures are just a ton of fun in that area. And then the second one is, what do I think of when I'm walking through a forest? And that is the mosquito. And what is the D&D mosquito but the sturge? So my combat one is I'm sending swarms of sturge at him through the forest to chase him through.
Oh, nice. I like that. It's good.
Yeah.
The ones that I picked were actually the kobold,
Mm-hmm.
the lizard folk, kenku, and trolls.
Oh,
Because I
nice.
always kind of think in terms of those are probably the creatures that are going to be spending a lot of time in a forest area. And
Mm-hmm.
so I picked those for that specific reason. The kenku I selected because they're bird folk and it's a forest. So,
Mm-hmm.
bird
Absolutely.
forest makes a lot of sense as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. I like those picks. Those are some of my favorite creatures too. All the classics are coming out tonight. I love it.
Grasslands or plains? What sort of wandering monsters do you have for grasslands and plains?
For the combat one is a swooping dragon. Someone just have this dragon that's flying overhead, maybe looking for something to pick up and eat. The characters are walking down this path. They've got like grain on both sides. All of a sudden, this dark shadow comes over them, and they turn over, look, and there's a red dragon that's kind of swooping down on them. And then I'd probably put something up in front of them that they'd be able to run and maybe get shelter in. My second one, which would be my role playing one, is when I think planes, I think trails and paths between cities and stuff. So I put a caravan, maybe some humanoid that is driving a cart, with two horses. Maybe he's got like a magic shop on the back or something like that, and he's some kind of a guild merchant or things of that nature. But I thought that would be a decent one, and perhaps that guild merchant's broken down, so they stumble across him.
The ones that I sort of were attracted to was the hyena with the knoll.
Ooh.
So I mean, when you got knolls, there's
Mm-hmm.
usually hyenas around, and when you got hyenas, chances are that knolls aren't too far behind as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked them and the cyclops and the hobgoblin
Oh, nice.
for sort of essentially because they fulfill different purposes
Mm-hmm.
because they are one slightly different difficulties and also two because I mean frankly how often do we see the hobgoblins usually are military based, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the chances are if you came across a hobgoblin troop or wandering monster, it's going to be a large contingent, either moving their forces from one location to another,
Mm-hmm.
or it's a small troop trying to link up with the larger force.
And I'm impressed on the Cyclops too. That's a monster I really want to use a little bit more. In fact, I think my Dragon Heist crew might be in for it since our entire campaign is set on eyeballs and the Cyclops. Yeah, that's gonna definitely make an appearance. I'll let him know that you sent it.
I guess the next one I have is what about mountains? Mountains are a very common location that we would be traveling through. What would be a great wandering monster for a mountainous area?
I had a little bit of trouble coming up with my favorites for the mountains, and I would probably just go with giants, and I'm going to combine them on this one so they could either be a combat foe or perhaps the giants are interested in capturing them because they need more workers for inside their giant castle or whatever it is that giants do. So I would probably just go with either fire giants or whatever type of giants would be in the area.
So I was thinking in terms of, I mean, common mountainous area would be the stone giant,
Okay.
which usually aren't going to be terribly aggressive towards you, although getting rocks lobbed at you seems to be their common strategy, doesn't it? From high above while you're down below, and then of course you've got to climb the mountain, which is like difficult terrain, and it's going to take you like a couple of hours. By the time you get
Mm-hmm.
to the top, you're probably dead. Yeah. And then the hell giant, because
Mm-hmm.
hells are usually pretty close to mountains, so that's another
Mm-hmm.
option. So it makes a lot of sense. I
Absolutely.
selected the ogre, the etin, and the troll. And for lower end, I put down kobold and orc. I think dungeon masters can have some variation if they want. They can kind of make a bit of a chart. But if it doesn't make sense to have that particular monster, even though it might be roaming in that area,
Mm-hmm.
you can just have a chart that says, roll a d6, and you may come across two kobolds.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you roll a two, you get four kobolds. Or if you roll a three, you get a couple of kobolds and maybe an orc that's traveling with them, or something like that.
That makes
So I
sense.
think people need to be quite selective. Wandering monsters should make sense to the adventure and the campaign that you are running. And
Mm-hmm.
it isn't, you shouldn't, I don't really feel like you go completely random with wandering monsters.
When I was a kid and I was playing D&D, I would roll all the time because I loved rolling on random tables. In fact, that's how I made my entire dungeons. I picked my Wandering Monsters chart and I just made a bunch of rooms and I rolled and put all these different monsters in here that didn't match. But now that I run games nowadays, I pretty much just go through the list and be like, oh, that makes sense. I'm gonna put this monster here walking through, and yeah, I totally agree. I much prefer as a DM to kind of select what I want.
And I actually picked out another location, which I didn't tell you about.
Okay.
Um, and I selected the swamp.
Ooh,
And instead of asking you what you think, I'm just going to tell you what I think. I make a good selection of wandering monsters,
okay.
and I put down the kobold,
Mm-hmm.
lizard folk, because they are very much into the swamp areas, and I put down the crocodile.
Oh yes.
Absolutely, got to be a crocodile, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And then the ogre, orc, and troll. And I mean, you like I said, you can fall back on goblin, orc, ogre,
Mm-hmm.
pretty much for almost any location that we've listed right now.
Mm-hmm.
So they're very generic. But if it doesn't make sense to your environment and the population, because we're really looking at the bigger population
Right.
for that location rather than the obscure,
Mm-hmm.
unless you deliberately have a troll with four arms that is constantly roaming the area trying to eat everything it comes across.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one of my characters encountered a crocodile in the swamp, and I don't ever want to go back. Those things are vicious. They are not. It about took out our entire party within 15 minutes of starting the game.
So thank you, Wally, for your input on today's topic of wandering monsters.
Thank you very much for having me, Fred. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really enjoyed this subject.
Thank you, Wally. So, look, if you guys are enjoying this content, I would suggest going and checking out Wally's channel and my channel. If you want to support both of us, we both have affiliate links to Amazon and other locations. We also have a Patreon page. I'm pretty sure I've got merchandise. Have you got merchandise enabled yet?
Not yet. I have to hit 10,000 subscribers. We're really close, so once we hit there, we'll have a Wally DM shirt.
Absolutely. And otherwise, just watch our videos is always a good way of
Yep.
supporting us for both channels. Share, like, subscribe, hit the bell button so you get notified, all those sorts of things. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s. There's this book, I believe, was this written by somebody that you know, Wally? Not
Absolutely,
you.
my alter ego, Wally DM. Yes, absolutely. That's a perfect way to support me and to give hours and hours of enjoyment or frustration to your players.